and welcome to you all at this Indigenous Knowledge and Academy SIG webinar. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, based on wherever you are. I am, as chat says, a Marma Indigenous person from the Chittagong Hill Tracts of Bangladesh. And also currently as a research scientist at NYU. I also teach course, and I'm a former co-chair of this IKS SIG, and it has been home for my intellectual work, as well as meeting indigenous researchers and practitioners from different parts of the world. And one of the goal of this CIES Indigenous Knowledge and the Academy SIG, which started with Professor Lesidia Semali many years ago, and bringing the indigenous knowledge and indigenous ways of knowing in the academia. And as a co-chair, when our communities, one of the goals is to connect with indigenous researchers, scholars, and also others who are not indigenous, but studying indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, and bringing those into academia, discussing, highlighting, and bringing multiple voices in the academia. So over the last, I would say, 6 years that I know of the IKS SIG, and it has existed many years before, indigenous knowledge and the academic SIG within this CIES. One of the goals is also capacity building. That means that to connect with the young researchers and indigenous scholars, and sharing a platform where we can learn from each other. We can hear from each other, discuss and learn. And today's talk, Dr. Prem Phyak, and I am very, very excited and looking forward to it, is to hear about his work, his perspectives, and also learn from him, as well as have a Q&A discussion, I believe, after his talk. So Chad mentioned about decades of indigenous languages, and which is also an important part of my own academic research, indigenous language revitalization. And I think that because language is such an integral part of indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing. Around the world, there are other issues that indigenous people confront. Many of them are remarkably similar, even though we live in so many different countries across all the continents. And what I say, one thing is that indigenous people have been marginalized, driven to extinctions from their land, as well as their language and culture. In the past, indigenous communities suffer in their places very much. But I think that this time we have the ability to connect like this through Zoom. And during the CIES meetings, at the higher level, we also promoted to have ways for Indigenous scholars to participate in the conferences. So it is not limited to Indigenous scholars in the Western countries or in handful of few countries, but it is a platform for Indigenous peoples all over the world. And with that spirit, we like to invite Dr. Prem Phyak to talk about Indigenous knowledge, decoloniality, and resisting deficit ideologies, lessons from the grassroots. So with that, I would like to pass it to Dr. Prem Phyak. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Neil and Ched and everyone who is here. So thank you for coming. I think it's, I don't know where you are, but it's good morning. It's good morning from Hong Kong, maybe good afternoon, good evening, or maybe not good night. So yes, thank you for your opening remark, Dr. Neil. So I'll be talking about, so maybe for half an hour, these three concepts, basically Indigenous knowledge, decoloniality, and resistance, basically about deficit ideologies from the grassroots. So I'm focusing on these concepts because when we talk about all Indigenous issues, including language revitalization, education, conservation, or even political rights, I think it's really important to see these three concepts together. So we can't really have one thing at a time, right? So these three concepts, Indigenous knowledge or epistemologies, decoloniality, and resistance, basically about deficit ideologies, are very integrated in one issue that is more like Indigenous issue. So my argument throughout this talk will be, so we can't really take these concepts one at a time if we are really serious about Indigenous issues, right? So this is my topic, as I said, Indigenous knowledge, decoloniality, and resisting deficit ideologies, lessons from the grassroots. So to be to begin with, so what is Indigenous knowledge, IK, or epistemology? So there are different perspectives about defining Indigenous knowledge. So some scholars use folk knowledge, some scholars use traditional knowledge, some scholars even use local knowledge. But I'm using Indigenous knowledge as kind of overarching concepts that is basically a cumulative body of knowledge and beliefs handed down through generations by cultural transmission about the relationship of living beings, including humans, and with one another and with their environment. So this is Burke's definition. It's a little old one, but it's still really important to see. So in this definition, so there are basically three things. So one is Indigenous knowledge is not really kind of like some total of specific, chunks of the knowledge, but it's kind of integrated and cumulative body of knowledge, not only knowledge as a quantifiable entity, but also beliefs. And that's the first thing. And the second is it is handed down through generations by cultural transmission. So the generational interactions in Indigenous knowledge is key. And most importantly, which is we need to really acknowledge in Indigenous knowledge system, is the connections of the people, living beings, with the environment, right? So Indigenous people have a very strong linkage with the place, the environment where they come from. So basically, it's a cumulative body of knowledge and beliefs. It's a intergenerational transmission and interactions, and always the connection between living beings and environment. So there is another concept used by scholars and researchers in indigenous scholarship. So that is indigenous epistemology. So with David Gagio and Watson Gagio, I really like their work in Solomon Island. So which I will be talking about them later. So basically, indigenous epistemology refers to a cultural groups. It's a ways of theorizing knowledge. It's not only the ways of course, learning and ways of knowing things, but also ways of theorizing the knowledge system. So with this brief introduction of what indigenous knowledge and epistemologies are in theory, so let me talk about what. Okay. Let me talk about why IK matters, why indigenous knowledge matters, right? So the work of Kaland 2000 basically discuss three important overarching importance of indigenous knowledge. So the first one is indigenous people have very extensive empirical knowledge about their environment. So in other words, their knowledge system emerges from the environment where they are. Second, these knowledge systems offer very strong interpretations of empirical knowledge, radically different from the conventional scientific program. So there is always this kind of confrontation and tensions in scholarship, basically among researchers, that indigenous knowledge is not scientific, and the scientific versus indigenous knowledge, right? But so Kaland and other scholars argue that indigenous knowledge has very strong interpretation of empirical knowledge because it emerges from their long history of lived experiences with the environment. And finally, so there are important lessons to be learned by studying the workings of indigenous resources, resource management regime. So it's basically about how we indigenous people manage resources. So when we say management of the resources, it includes not only the material resources, even non-material systems, including languages, for example, cultures, right? Folk practices. And there are very strong and very transformative practices of managing, for example, biodiversity, nature, water. So, all these things are really important in understanding both past and present, and of course, maybe the future development of how knowledges are constructed in indigenous communities. So, but this is very problematic, and sometimes I feel and I ask myself, what are we doing with this schooling, that modern schooling system? So in general, so there is a consensus among critical scholars and particularly the people from indigenous communities. Always questioning, are we doing justice to the people coming from different backgrounds with this very notion of schooling? When I say justice, it is not just like justice in general, but also justice in terms of knowledge, right? So, and we have been taking this concept of schooling as a granted for long, but eventually, it's about coloniality of knowledge, and which basically is consider a construct schooling as education, right? So, but education is not schooling. Schooling is very reductionist form of education, right? So education, quite often for indigenous people, as we see from all over the world, schooling is not really that friendly for indigenous people. I have tweeted on my social media last week that schools have become very hostile spaces for indigenous people to use their languages and culture, indigenous, their knowledge. and also their identity. How do they feel in the schooling, right? So as Mauriel, it's very interesting book, paper written in 1999. So who actually questions the whole this philosophy and the notion of schools and schooling, and argues schooling consecrated a Western worldview that isolates human beings from nature. And this raised a conflict with indigenous knowledges because schooling broke holisticity, one of the bases of indigenous knowledge. So as we see from this quote that, the schools became very Westernized, Westernized space, not as a physical space, but as a space where knowledges are constructed, right? But eventually what happened, as Mauriel argues, is human beings are isolated from nature. And most importantly, it broke this notion of holisticity, right? That is the major base of indigenous knowledge. So I think this history of coloniality of knowledge, or what counts as a knowledge, basically begin with this institutionalization of knowing or knowledge in schooling, right? Or schooling or schools are institutionalized as the builder of knowledge or constructor of the knowledge. However, there are issues with from indigenous perspectives. I think you must have gone through Sabelo, Ndlovu Gatseni's work. He basically talks about decoloniality, brings very strong and historical perspectives from the global South, particularly from Africa. So he wrote a paper in 2013. So he basically, this is a very interesting paper. He questions then why decoloniality in the 21st century? So the fundamental question, which I'm reading what he has said, the fundamental question which has consistently cried for a response throughout the global South and Third World, an epistemic side that experienced the darker side of modernity, is that of how to extricate or ex-colonialize the people from coloniality, right? African countries are prominent in this group of nations, and Africa has experienced the slave trade, imperialism, colonialism, apartheid, neo-colonialism, even neoliberalism, and today, of course, globalization. Then together, these processes constitute coloniality as a global power structure that sustains asymmetrical power relations between the Euro-American world and the global South. So basically, coloniality as the combination of all these forms of historical exploitations, right? That is experienced through very darker side of modernity, right? Colonialism, neo-colonialism, and of course, as we see now, it's a neoliberalism and globalization. So that sets the background of coloniality, and Maldonado Torres in 2007 defines coloniality as a long-standing patterns of power that emerge as a result of colonialism, but that define culture, labor, intersubjectivity, relations, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limitation of colonial administration. Thus, coloniality survives colonialism, and it is maintained alive in books, in the criteria for academic performances, as we see in our university systems, in cultural patterns, in common sense, in the self-image of people, in aspirations of self, and in so many other aspects of our modern experiences. So in a way, as modern subjects, we breathe coloniality all the time and every day. So basically, Maldonado Torres problematizes the distinctions between coloniality and colonialism. So of course, colonialism is a more administrative regime, but coloniality is more about long-standing patterns of the power that travels through, that remains alive through books, university education, and other forms of performances and the ways of doing in the modern world, right? So again, Ndlovu Gatseni's quote, like, that's why coloniality must be unmasked and resisted and destroyed, because it produces a world order that can only be sustained through a combination of violence, deceit, hypocrisy, and lies. This unmasking and resistance entails decoloniality as a political cum epistemological liberatory project. So I really like this notion of decoloniality as a political cum epistemological liberatory project. It's not only political, but also epistemological, right? These two concepts really go together. So it's really important, important for people who take decolonial projects. So to unmask the coloniality and resist and see how this resistance contributes to the transformation of the sustained combination of historical violence, deceit, and lies, right? So yeah, it's a political, right? But at the same time, it is epistemological, right? So we need to really work with the epistemologies that indigenous people have constructed or have been passing down from one generation to another generation. So there are three premises of decoloniality. Again, I draw on Maldonado Torres and Ndlovu Gatseni. So the first one is, it's really important for us to understand coloniality of power. So basically, who possesses the power to make decisions? For example, zone of being and zone of non-being, right? Basically, the modern power structure is very asymmetrical, and which is maintained by, of course, very much like Western colonial systems, and actually by these abyssal lines, right? And yeah, for example, there are so many examples that we can talk about. For example, technology and the politics, even the global economic ideologies and values such as neoliberalism. Also, this coloniality of knowledge. So another is coloniality exists in the form of knowledge, which basically focuses on teaching out epistemological issues, politics of knowledge generation, as well as questioning who generates which knowledge and for what purpose. I think this is very key issue, particularly from researchers' point of view, because when we are doing research, like whose knowledge is generated and who benefits from that knowledge, right? And how do we actually construct those knowledge, and how do we carry out research? The work of Tuhiwai Linda Smith in Maoris, I think I will be talking about it briefly later. So for example, questions, how researchers, or how this research has been a very much like colonial concept and tool that systematically erases the knowledge of the indigenous people, right? And the last one, most important one, I think one of the important components of decoloniality is questioning the coloniality of being, right? So it basically refers to the effects of coloniality in lived experiences, not only in the mind, right? So how are we affected, impacted by this long-standing structure of the power that has been always, of course, oppressive for people, indigenous people around the world. So basically, these three concepts are really important to understand if we are taking more like decolonial perspective. So questioning the coloniality of power, questioning the coloniality of knowledge, and questioning the coloniality of being. So basically, this idea of the coloniality of being also includes the idea of who is recognized as, legitimate, in terms of identity. So legitimate producer of the knowledge, for example. So who possesses the knowledge, right? So all these, the coloniality of power, coloniality of being, coloniality of knowledge, contributes to this whole notion of deficit ideology and epistemicide, right? Basically, deficit ideologies are assumptions that inequalities are individual but not socio-historical. So there are, and educational studies, there are there are a lot of critical concerns about how, how underperformance, underachievement of indigenous children are seen as their own responsibility. In other words, they are blamed for underachieving, but not the system. So look at the whole framing of, discourses about language and language education or education policies. So we actually are moving away from the historical or systemic issues that have basically contributed to inequalities in terms of achievement in education, in terms of access to the resources and the knowledge, even in terms of access to systems, right, in general. So what I'm basically saying is we are, if we don't really question this coloniality of power, coloniality of being, and coloniality of knowledge, we keep reproducing these deficit ideologies in one or, in other ways, so in multiple ways. So we keep blaming the victim, but not the system. And we really, we really move away from the major problem, and we never really get into the core of the issues, right? So we often, these discourses, actually, these deficit views often sees indigenous people as non-epistemic beings. So in other words, these people don't bring anything, or don't have anything in terms of, for example, learning, right? So this often happens in the school system, basically. For example, most often, maybe in Philippines, Indonesia, or throughout the world, like, the languages and the cultures in the schools or modern school system remain, as a problem, or they are seen as a problem, right? But they are not embraced as a resource. They are not embraced as an integral part of knowledge building process. In other words, what I'm basically saying is, the indigenous children who come to school with their own languages, powerful, very rich languages and cultural system, the knowledge system, are not recognized, if none, right? Do you hear me?
Yes, Prem. Maybe you can turn off your camera so that it will. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, what I'm basically saying is this very notion of like epistemic being really draws on this the issue of coloniality of being, because who is recognized as legitimate knower, right? So whose knowledge is recognized. So in other words, if we don't really recognize languages and knowledge system of children, indigenous children, then we are telling them that they are just non-epistemic beings. So they have nothing, right? They have nothing to do in the schools out there. Their knowledge has no value in the school system, right? So that's what deficit ideology does. And our discourses, policies, and plans and systems in many ways are reproducing this kind of identity of indigenous people, children, as non-epistemic beings, right? So this contributes to this epistemicide, the eraser of indigenous knowledge and values and systems that Santos has written this very interesting book, Epistemologies of the South. So what I'm basically saying is, we really need to see how the ways of doing the discourses and policies and plans are actually erasing the indigenous knowledge, values, and systems. So that's what Santos calls epistemicide. So with this, let me briefly talk about then what should be done. So my perspectives are basically drawn from my work in Nepal, but I also draw on some other scholars' work here. So, but let me begin with what I have done in Nepal. So, the colonial projects, I think we really need to start from the grassroots. So it includes, for example, community, small communities, the communities of teachers or communities of, youth, for example. But this is one project that I worked with the Newar indigenous people who are mainly based in the capital city of Nepal. So basically, we work with there is a campaign called Newa Schools in Newa Settlements. Newa is a kind of indigenous term for Newar language. So the project basically highlights how, focuses on how the community and schools can be connected, or how schools and community can work together to revitalize Newa language, pass down the cultural knowledge, indigenous knowledge of Newa to younger generations, and reclaim historical identity, right? So they basically, focus on these three concepts. So one is place-based pedagogy. So because indigenous people value places, right? The lands where they come from, where they live in. And the knowledge actually is constructed in the place, and also it is closely connected to the past, that is historical identity, right? So for example, they have created their own textbooks. The books are basically based on what community elders talk about the history and their life experiences. And for example, unlike the mainstream textbooks or the national textbooks, for example, they include various concepts such as hiti, which basically refers to in Newar language, it refers to water spring, and falsa, meeting places, because these hiti and falsa, they were very important places for Newar indigenous people to live. For example, in the town now, it's like full of concrete, right? So they used to have hiti, and hiti is a place where they get water. Not only they get water, but also they come together and interact and talk to each other, right? And there is the falsa, which is meeting places. So still they exist, but most falsas are gone by this modern development, including road expansions and buildings, construction of the buildings and big projects, for example. So in their books, so they would really like to focus on these kind of concepts and talk to and help younger generation understand how these concepts, are not just like concepts as such, but they are also connected to their places, indigenous knowledge, and historical identities. For example, they celebrate in schools, and they have textbooks, and also celebrate this festival. For example, Vintuna, which is New Year. It's a very different New Year from the National New Year. And also Yomari Pudni, it's a specific a festival for Newar indigenous people. In that, they make very special food called Yomari, and that symbolizes the arrival of the harvest season and the fresh crops. So basically, they perform all these things with the students in the school. So by inviting community members, parents, and helping younger generation to make Yomari. So what I'm basically saying is these are just examples. So there are a lot of examples like this. So decolonial projects, I think we really need to see, decolonial projects as a reclamation of the place as well. So for example, place-based pedagogy in the case of this project, right? And also helping students understand this historical meaning of all these places. It's not just about teaching the meaning of these words in the second language or maybe third language, but it's really important to help them understand how these concepts are related to places. Most often in language teaching and language education, so we just teach our students the meaning in dominant language. We just like focus on language, but we really need to go beyond lingua-centric or language-centric view and have more like deeper understanding of how they constitute place and history. All right. So maybe some of you remember this Julius Nyerere's quote in 1968. So who argues that, you know, schools are not really helping our kids to understand communities, right? So, for example, you know, this is a quote from Nyerere. So, at present, our pupils learn to despise even their own parents because they are old-fashioned and ignorant. There is nothing in our existing education system which suggests to the pupil that he or she can learn important things about farming from his or her elders. The result is that he or she absorbs beliefs about witchcraft before he or she goes to school, but does not learn the properties of local grasses. He absorbs the taboos from his family, but does not learn the methods of making nutritious traditional foods. And from school, he or she acquires knowledge unrelated to agriculture life, and he or she gets the worst of both systems. So this is very powerful. You know, it was 1968 that when he said this, but still, you know, because our schooling, I think, and the education system has, in a way, like, you know, taken our kids away from the communities. And most often we don't see that kind of community awareness, place-based awareness and historical awareness in our kids or in ourselves, for example. So that's the major point that decolonial projects should actually acknowledge, right? And it's a focus on how community can be a space for schooling. So here is another project that I am in the community organization called Kirat Yaktung Chumlung organized the last summer. So this is called Integrating Indigenous Language, Arts, and Knowledge. So it's a program for the youths who were never taught about their language, culture, and knowledge in schools. So this is the organization called Kirat Yaktung Chumlung, which is the Indigenous National Organization of Limbu Indigenous people, where I come from. So, for example, language is really important. So they are learning language and script. So script, it has really own script, but these youths have never learned about the script, right? The script is not just like, you know, representation of what we speak, but also the very artistic, right? There are, it's very artistic script. Writing script is not just about representing what we're speaking in the form of writing, but also there are different symbols and signs and they need to put into place, right? It's more like artistic. So as you see, another form of like indigenous knowledge is art. So we have, I think it's art-based pedagogies. I think it's really important to integrate in the colonial projects. For example, in this project, these youths are actually drawing on the arts that are drawn in the Limbu house in the rural villages by community elders, actually in front of houses, right? And here you can see the youths are actually weaving, and they bring like bamboo sticks, and they just like have different colors of ropes, and they just like you know, weave. And it's called, they are making actually silam sakma, which basically refers to blocking the path of the death. So which is very symbolic, you know, for Limbu indigenous people. in most houses they keep it, because by keeping it they believe that so there is no kind of misfortune happening in the future. So it blocks the path of the death and other sort of like evil events, for example, right? And what is most important is, as you see in this picture, so it's really important to help indigenous youth connect or interact with the community elders, right? So in here you can see the parents and some community elders come and tell their stories to the younger generations, right? So this is how these younger generations do not just learn language and script, they also integrate art, and they also have, by doing this, they also understand indigenous values and knowledge, and they also understand how elders' experiences are actually important in the process of learning. And in other words, they are recognizing their elders as epistemic subjects, not necessarily someone who would always tell, okay, do this and do that, but also seeing them as very valuable people with very rich experiences, right? This is another project from Solomon Island. David Gagio and Karen Watson-Gagio, they work with indigenous people, Kwarai indigenous people. So basically, the one is genealogy project. So as you all know, the genealogy is all about, understanding our parents, grandparents, and, our ancestors, and, see the connections. Where do we come from? So basically, they are interested in how Native Pacific Islander scholars practice decolonization. Basically, for them, decolonization exists in the form of, dehumanization. It's really dehumanization as decolonization. So humanization is coloniality, and dehumanization is the decolonization. So basically, they focus on different traditional knowledge and knowledge system, for example, custom, right? And they spend time at the BC, for example, how people actually spend time at Bishi, for example, which is literally translated as menstrual hot, occupied much of their time discussing and reckoning knowledge, and also men. For example, the BC is for women, and the men did the same in the Fera, which is they call like men's house. So in other words, like how these places have become not just as a places where they live, but also places to discuss and come together and understand what is happening in the community. So also the meetings, the meetings, for example, so with was basically teaching and counseling sessions in the village meetings are known as Fama Nata Anga. So these spaces are the spaces where community meet and the construct knowledge. So remember, it's not only in the school that the communities, that the indigenous people are learning things, but actually there are different concepts and different epistemologies and the ways of knowing in the community, right? So that's why they work on these kind of indigenous epistemologies that dehegemonizes the traditional, not traditional, I mean dominant forms of the knowledge that we have been talking about. Yeah, I'm sorry. So decolonization is hegemonization, not homogenization. Of course, dehomogenization is also a form of decolonization, but basically Gagio and Watson-Gagio talk about dehegemonization. And another project they talk about is Oka Village Youth Project. So they basically work with these youths in connecting to connect how with their elders. So how to connect the youth with the elders, so which is a big challenge for indigenous communities around the world. in this case, like they do a number of activities. For example, one is soccer game and the football, where older members taught younger how to play soccer, and also they coach them in the games. And also a group of their 40s to 70s taught the young men about traditional culture and dances. So they bring all these things together. So and they develop this notion of indigenous knowledge and praxis. In other words, critical indigenous praxis, which is basically reflecting on what indigenous people are doing. And we need to reflect on what are the meanings of what we have been doing in terms of knowledge construction, to what extent we are actually able to generate the critical awareness and questioning historicity of this hegemonization or homogenization. So basically, these two projects actually, the first project basically, talks about what are different diverse ways of knowing. The second project basically helps youth to connect with the elders and develop more like critical indigenous knowledge and praxis. This is reconnecting art and science for sustainability, learning from indigenous knowledge through participatory action research. So I think in decolonizing research methods, as Linda Tuhiwai-Smith has argued, and other indigenous scholars have argued, it's really important to focus on participatory projects, because it's through research we have been not really able to embrace, the ways of knowing and how indigenous people are building knowledge, right? So research has been very much like, very much like Western colonial form of knowledge construction. So in this project, so they basically do participatory action research, and in that, community members also bring their own agenda, right? Research questions come from community members. They design how to explore and address those research questions, and how to plan, right, for the future. So this is the project is the Kauai Wate group in Amazon. So basically, research problems are defined by communities, and as I said, they work on different ways of knowing, their own systems of knowing. So it's not like science as very much like the modern science as we define. Indigenous people, indigenous communities have very different forms of science, of the ways of knowing, right, more scientifically. This is another project by from Maori, Te Aika and Greenwood, who use this notion of ta to'u ki a ta to'u. So all of us together are working for all of us. So it basically represents the collectivity or collectivism of the indigenous group. So this concept is very much embedded in mythic understandings of knowledge, that Tane climbed to the heavens and brought back and shared 3 kete, which is basket of knowledge. So it's very interesting, myth about knowledge. So different indigenous communities have different myths about knowing, about knowledge, right? Not only about human beings, but also their relationship with the environment and history. So each provided access to a particular sphere of knowledge, from the esoteric to the practical, and each was assigned to those who would be best explore and develop that knowledge for the well-being of the people. So there is another project called, Kaupapa Maori Research, which is very dominant, one of the very successful Maori research project, indigenous project. So it basically refers to the fact that we need to build on capacity and development of well-being of the iwi people, as the primary goal of research, which emphasizes the importance of accountability to iwi and signals preference for methodology and methods that engage participants as co-constructors of the findings, not just like receivers of the findings who are seen as readily subjects who are readily waiting for the findings, listen to the findings. So it's really important to build on what they have been doing and work from their own perspectives as well. So it's really important for Indigenous researchers to continue to focus on participatory action research, not necessarily defining ourselves what research questions are and designing ourselves what research designs are important for them, but it's really important for all of us to bring their perspectives in problem selections and the design. So with this, I think I was trying to argue that the decolonizing approach do not occur in a linear fashion. Rather, they are a complex entanglement of activism, community engagement, and imagination for the equitable future. As we discussed, like decolonizing approach must begin with the critical understanding of oppressive histories and systemic erasure of indigenous languages, values, epistemologies, and analysis of how such erasure reinforces the coloniality of monolingual, modernist, homogeneous ideology in education and other spheres of our life, for example. So just to go back, it's really important to focus on how coloniality exists through power, knowledge, and being, right? And that's why it's really important for all of us to pay attention to community, grassroots, and indigenous ways of knowing and epistemology, because communities have been very resilient. Communities have been doing this, right? So decolonial knowledge construction, that's why knowledge construction processes very much uphold participatory approaches and embrace the long-term commitment to writing the wrong history through community engagement. So basically, actually for the whole community building for indigenous people is participatory, right? There is nothing like, very much individualistic views about community building. So that's why for researchers, it's really important to recognize how these communities build communities, right? And build on their ways of being together or coming together. And that's what participatory approaches can learn from, or we can learn from. So it's really important it's really time for us to write as a verb, write the wrong history through the community engagement.